about tragedy and how a tragedy differs from an epic. So, first of all, in the chapter 6 that we can find here, a, a tragedy is an imitation of an action. So, the action must be serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. So, here three terms are so important. One is serious, number two is complete, and number three is of a certain magnitude. So, what do you think about serious and seriousness? Serious indicates that this type of poetry will deal with very grave incidents and events of significance. And you know that this type of poetry or tragedy deals with the noble class of people, their noble actions and noble activities. So it implies some seriousness in these activities. Maybe they are struggling with their fate, struggling against the will of God, like this. So these are so serious issues and serious human conditions. Then, what do you mean by completeness? The thing of completeness has different, I think, needs different spaces for discussion. Why a tragedy must be complete? And what is the completeness? So, we'll discuss in our later classes. And then of a certain magnitude. That means it will not deal with base things or ignoble things. So it must have some heightened sphere of human life or the questions of human life or the problems of human life and existence. And then about the language, it is embellished with each kind of artistic ornament. That means the language must be artistic and it must possess some artistic value. And then what does a poetry do? A poetry arouses pity and fear in the audiences. What does it mean? It means whenever an audience will just enjoy the tragedy or will watch the tragedy, they will first of all they will have pity on the heroes who is being fallen down, and fear. Why fear? The fate of that hero, how it has been molded, and how it becomes suppressed and suppressed due to some activities made by the hero and maybe a fate that we find in Oedipus King Oedipus. This type of downfalling, that a king being a king, he is falling down. So we are the common human being, so it may happen to us. Therefore, a sense of fear arises in the audience that it may happen to anyone. Pity for the hero and fear for the audiences. And then what happens at the last of the tragedy? The purgation of these emotions, These emotions indicate pity and fear. So purgations means release of those emotions. Why it releases from the audience? That at last audience will take pity and then he will get frightened. But at last he will think that, oh, it didn't happen to me. It happened only King Oedipus. So this sense of ownership and this sense of distinctness from the tragedy make the audience like that they are not involved in the story, like they are out of that context, out of that story, so it will never happen to us. This sense of distinctiveness indicates here purgation, release of these pitiful and fearful emotions. So a tragedy must have these characteristics. And how it differs from an epic? In the previous chapter, Aristotle has discussed that both of them imitates imitates you know, but in case of epic, here he says, epic poetry agrees with tragedy insofar as it is an imitation in verse of characters of higher type. That means the epic poetry and tragedy they imitate the higher type of characters, but they differ. Epic poetry admits but one kind of meter and is narrative in form. They differ again in their length. So, two things important, three things especially. One is a meter, number two, the narrative style, and number three, the length. So, in case of poetry epic, there is a different meter that is not used in tragedy, and an epic is a narrative form, and also, and tragedy on the other hand follows dramatic form. And then in case of length, it's very important that you have to remember this line, that a tragedy endeavors as far as possible to confine itself to a single revolution of the sun. So this great phrase, a single revolution of the sun, a single revolution of the sun, that a tragedy must follow a single revolution of sun. What do you mean by this single revolution of sun? It indicates that it will begin and end within a daytime, that the rising of the sun and before the setting of the sun, it will evolve. Every action will evolve within this time. And if it happens that there is a slight lapses within this boundary, so Aristotle admits this. He says, but slightly to exceed this limit, the tragedy may exceed slightly. But on the other hand, the epic action has no limits of time. Epic doesn't have that limit. You know that an epic may include thousands of years, hundreds of years, maybe 24 of years, maybe more than 10 of years, you know. And then is a second point of difference, that though at first the same freedom was admitted in tragedy as in the epic. So it is indicating that first of all, tragedy didn't have this limit of time as the epic. So we can assume here that the limitation of time was ordained on tragedy later on. Then, of their constituent parts, some are common to both. That means epic and tragedy has some common features and also some peculiar to tragedy, and there are also some differences. That what is this similarities? All the elements of an epic poem are found in tragedy. That means the tragedy covers every element of an epic, but the elements of a tragedy are not all found in the epic poem. So, tragedy is a grand art form more than an epic because tragedy includes every epic. So, that means from a tragedy you can construct an epic, but from an epic you may not construct a tragedy. So tragedy includes everything. Then what is the probable characteristics of epic? You have to know this. And what are the probable characteristics of tragedy? You have to know this to distinguish between these two things. So we will gradually develop these discourses about the differences of tragedy and differences of epic. Just first of all, we are just hinting here something. So in the chapter 5, there is some characteristic features of tragedy and also epic poetry, and in the chapter 6, the definition of tragedy is given, and also the theory of purgation of pity and fear has been dealt with. And what do you mean by pity and fear, and what do you mean by purgation? So, what the spectators expect from a tragedy, and what the poet or tragedy writer expects from the spectators have been dealt with here. So today, no more today. I think you are clear about the definition of tragedy, the time limit of the tragedy, some distinctions between tragedy and epic poetry.